In this episode, we're going to focus on something that sounds simple until you try to do it well: creating notices, policies, and procedures that users actually trust, not just documents that exist. For the Certified Information Privacy Technologist (CIPT) exam, you need to understand how transparency and accountability show up in real systems and real organizations, and a major part of that is how you communicate and then follow through. Beginners sometimes assume that a privacy notice is just a legal page, a policy is just an internal rulebook, and a procedure is just a checklist someone in compliance owns. But trust doesn't work that way. Trust is built when what you say matches what you do, when choices are real, when changes are explained in human terms, and when the organization behaves consistently over time. That means these artifacts are not separate from engineering and operations. They are part of the product experience and the organizational behavior that supports it. By the end, you should be able to explain what each artifact is for, how they connect, and what practical signals make them trustworthy to real people. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Let's start by separating notices, policies, and procedures in a way that makes them usable. A notice is primarily outward-facing and is about telling people what data is collected, why it is collected, how it is used, who it is shared with, how long it is kept, and what choices or rights they have. A policy is primarily inward-facing and sets the organization's rules and commitments, describing what the organization will do and not do, who is responsible, and what standards must be followed. A procedure is the step-by-step operational method that people follow to implement a policy and to produce consistent outcomes, like how a data request is handled or how a new vendor is reviewed. You can think of notices as promises to users, policies as promises the organization makes to itself, and procedures as the way those promises are kept day after day. If one of these is missing or weak, trust suffers because the chain breaks somewhere. The exam can test this by presenting a mismatch, like a notice that claims something the system doesn't do, or a policy that exists but nobody follows, and asking what the best corrective action is. User trust begins with clarity, and clarity starts with knowing who the audience is for each document. A notice is for a wide range of people, including those who are not technical and who may be reading quickly, so clarity means plain language, predictable structure, and avoidance of vague statements that sound like permission slips. A policy is for employees and internal stakeholders, so clarity means defining responsibilities, scope, and enforcement, not just stating ideals. A procedure is for the people who will execute it, so clarity means concrete steps, decision points, and records that must be created, without leaving room for improvisation that creates inconsistency. Beginners sometimes try to write everything in one place, but trust improves when each artifact is fit for purpose and the boundaries are clear. A user should not have to decipher internal governance, and an employee should not have to guess how to apply a principle in daily work. When you respect the audience, you reduce confusion and reduce the chance of accidental misuse. Another major trust factor is alignment between words and system behavior, because a notice that is accurate only on paper is not trustworthy. If a notice says data is used for certain purposes, the system should not quietly use it for unrelated purposes through analytics pipelines, sharing arrangements, or internal access. If a notice says a user can opt out, the system should not keep processing opt-out data in downstream systems because the opt-out signal was not propagated. If a notice says data is retained for a limited period, retention controls should actually remove or delink data according to that period across primary and secondary storage. Trust collapses when users discover gaps between what was promised and what happened, and those gaps often come from drift, not malice. Drift happens when systems evolve faster than documentation, or when teams make local changes without updating notices. A strong privacy technologist treats alignment as a continuous task, not a one-time publication event, and the exam tends to reward answers that recognize that. Let's talk about how to make notices trustworthy at the moment a user encounters them, because timing and context matter as much as content. A long notice buried behind multiple clicks can be legally present, but still feel untrustworthy if it is disconnected from the moment data is collected. Trust improves when information is delivered close to the decision point, like explaining why a permission is needed when the permission is requested rather than after the fact. Trust also improves when notices are specific, such as describing categories of data and categories of use in a way that matches the product experience, instead of using broad, catch-all language. Another key factor is consistency across channels, meaning the notice content should not conflict between a website, an app, and support materials, because inconsistent messages create doubt. For beginners, the practical idea is that a notice is part of the user interface, even if it is technically a document. If it feels like an afterthought, users will treat it like an afterthought and assume the organization is hiding something. Policies build trust internally, which then supports external trust, because employees can't consistently keep promises they don't understand. A high-quality privacy policy defines what data categories matter, what principles guide collection and use, what approvals are needed for sensitive changes, and what obligations exist for vendors and partners. It should also define roles, including who is accountable for decisions, who is responsible for implementation, and who must be consulted or informed. Policies that are overly vague often fail because they cannot be operationalized, and policies that are overly rigid can fail because teams route around them when they need to move quickly. A trustworthy policy balances clear rules with clear processes for exceptions, so teams can handle unusual situations without breaking the overall governance model. On an exam, a common scenario is a team making a change without review, and the best answer often involves strengthening or enforcing policy-driven review and accountability rather than relying on informal reminders. Procedures are where trust becomes real, because procedures are the organization's repeatable behaviors. For example, if an organization promises users they can access or delete their data, the procedure defines how a request is received, how identity is verified, how the request is routed, how completion is confirmed, and what records are kept. If an organization promises it reviews vendors, the procedure defines what information is collected, what risk factors are evaluated, who approves, and how monitoring occurs over time. A procedure should also include what triggers escalation, such as when a request touches sensitive categories of data or when a system limitation prevents deletion. Without procedures, a policy becomes a wish, and without records, a procedure becomes a story rather than a demonstrable practice. In privacy technology, procedures often need to connect to systems, like ticketing workflows, audit logging, and change management gates. But the core idea is consistency. Trust grows when outcomes are predictable and fair, not when everything depends on who happens to answer an email. One of the most common ways trust is lost is through dark patterns or manipulative design choices, even if the organization thinks it is just optimizing engagement. A notice might be technically accurate but designed to be unreadable, or a choice might be presented in a way that pushes users toward the option that benefits the organization. Trust also suffers when users are forced into complicated steps to exercise a right, like making it easy to sign up but hard to leave or delete. While this episode is not about building interfaces, the exam expects you to recognize that trust is not only about the presence of information, but about whether that information is usable and whether choices are meaningful. A privacy technologist should be able to advise against designs that make user control performative rather than real. This is not just a moral issue. It is a risk issue because misleading experiences create complaints, regulatory attention, and reputational damage. Trust is an engineering and governance outcome, not a marketing claim. Another trust challenge is how organizations handle change, because users notice when rules shift without explanation. When data uses expand, when new partners are introduced, or when features begin collecting new data, organizations often update notices, but they may do it quietly and assume that is enough. Trust is stronger when change is communicated clearly and when the organization explains what changed, why it changed, and what choices users have in response. Internally, this means change management should include a privacy review step that evaluates whether notices and user controls need updating. It also means teams should maintain an inventory of data uses and sharing relationships so they can detect when a change triggers a transparency update. Beginners often imagine a notice as a static artifact, but in reality, it is more like a living alignment tool that must track the system as it evolves. Exam questions may ask what to do after a change, and the best answer often involves updating both user-facing notices and internal processes to keep them in sync. Let's connect this to evidence and accountability, because trust is strengthened when an organization can prove it does what it says. For notices, evidence might include decision records that show how notice statements were derived from data flows and processing purposes. For policies, evidence includes training records, approval logs, and enforcement mechanisms, showing the policy is not just a file on a server. For procedures, evidence includes tickets, logs, and completed request records, showing consistent execution. This is especially important for user requests and incident response, where timing, documentation, and consistent handling matter. The exam often rewards answers that recognize the need to demonstrate compliance and accountability, not just claim it. Beginners sometimes think evidence is only for regulators, but evidence also helps internal quality because it reveals where processes are breaking down. Trust is not only external, it's also the internal confidence that the organization is operating responsibly. A subtle but important trust factor is consistency of terminology and definitions across all artifacts, because inconsistent language creates confusion even when the underlying behavior is fine. If a notice uses one term for data categories and internal systems use another, teams may implement controls incorrectly. If a policy defines sensitive data differently than a procedure does, people won't know which rule applies, and they may accidentally underprotect or overcollect. Strong privacy programs invest in a shared vocabulary, like consistent definitions for personal data, identifiers, retention categories, and processing purposes. That shared vocabulary then shows up in notices, policies, and procedures so they reinforce each other. On the exam, you might see scenarios where teams interpret a requirement differently, and the best answer may involve clarifying definitions and aligning documents and processes. This sounds boring, but it is high yield because confusion is a common root cause of privacy failure. It's also worth noting that user trust depends on how an organization handles mistakes, because incidents and errors are inevitable in complex systems. If a mistake happens, users watch whether the organization communicates clearly, takes responsibility, and fixes root causes rather than making excuses. That means procedures for incident response and breach handling should be designed not only to meet obligations, but also to support truthful, timely communication and effective remediation. Trust is often rebuilt through transparency and action, not through perfect prevention. For the exam, this matters because you may be asked to choose a response that balances legal obligations, user communication, and technical remediation. A strong privacy technologist understands that policies and procedures should support that balance, and that notices may need updates if the incident reveals that previous statements were inaccurate. Treating mistakes as learning opportunities that lead to process improvement is part of mature governance. To make all of this practical in your mind, you can evaluate any notice, policy, or procedure with a set of trust questions that are easy to run mentally. First, does it match reality? Meaning, could you trace it to actual data flows and system behavior without hand-waving? Second, is it understandable for its audience? Meaning a user can make an informed choice or an employee can take consistent action. Third, does it support real control? Meaning it enables meaningful choices and rights rather than symbolic gestures. Fourth, does it have a maintenance path? Meaning changes in the system trigger updates so the artifact stays accurate. Fifth, does it produce evidence? Meaning you can show that what was promised was actually done. When an artifact fails one of these questions, you have found a trust gap, and the gap suggests the type of fix needed, whether it's revising language, improving workflow, or implementing technical enforcement. This approach mirrors how exam scenarios often work. Identify the trust gap and choose the most direct corrective action. When you can deploy notices, policies, and procedures that users trust, you are essentially building a system of promises and proof that holds up over time, even as products evolve and teams change. The CIPT exam expects you to recognize that trust is not generated by publishing text, but by aligning communication, governance, and operational behavior so that users experience consistency and respect. Notices tell people what is happening and why. Policies make the organization's commitments enforceable internally, and procedures turn those commitments into repeatable action with evidence. If you treat these as living parts of a privacy program rather than as paperwork, your reasoning becomes sharper because you start asking how words become behavior and how behavior stays aligned as things change. That is the heart of privacy technology work, and it is also the heart of many exam questions, because the best answer is often the one that strengthens alignment, accountability, and user control. With that perspective, trust becomes a practical engineering and governance goal, not an abstract aspiration.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.